we've got a few more people coming in, but we're going to go ahead and get started here with our introductions. Welcome. Good evening. My name is Spencer Morgan. I'm the Executive Director for the Theodore Roosevelt Inaugural Site. Thank you for joining us this evening on this beautiful Earth Day. For those here in person, as you walked in, you might have noticed our heap of limbs and our bags of leaves out in the parking lot. We had a wonderful day of service with Bank of America, and I wanted to give them a nice shout out to say thank you for all their hard work today, helping us get ready for the spring season. I also, I want to be diligent here and thank our sponsors for this evening's program, specifically M&T Bank. M&T Bank has been a huge supporter of the TR site, and we're so grateful to have them among our family. And today for Earth Day, I thought it would be appropriate that we raise our green flag and say thank you to M&T Bank for making this possible. Without further ado, let's get started. So a few housekeeping items just to get us out of the way. For those online, if you have questions, please put your questions in the chat box, and Miss Pat in the back here will read those aloud at the end of the program. And for those in our audience, please raise your hand at the end and we'll bring a mic over to you so you can ask your question and get an answer from our presenter. So it is my pleasure to introduce to you a special Earth Day TR Tuesday night speakers night, Birdwatcher in Chief. I love this title. Teddy Roosevelt and America's Birds. We welcome our friends from the Buffalo Audubon Society for this special program as well who are with us today. Right, wave your hand. Yeah, thank you. Following the presentation, we will also have some goodies here in the gallery space for those with us in person. So please stick around for some nice mingling and networking with our guest, Duane Jundt. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Duane Jundt, a native of North Dakota. What do we know North Dakota for? Lots of TR. Duane Jundt attended Minnesota State University, Moorhead, and the University of Notre Dame. He taught a variety of history courses at Notre Dame and Northwestern College in Iowa, and he is a member, I am as well, I don't know if you know that, on the advisory board for the Theodore Roosevelt Association, but since 2013 here. We've got an alum, I love it. He has published numerous review essays, articles, and book chapters on Theodore Roosevelt and has spoken on a variety of topics at museums, historical sites, states, and national parks, including Theodore Roosevelt, Rocky Mountain, and Mesa Verde. In 2022 and 2023, he undertook, along with the staff of the Theodore Roosevelt Center in Dickinson State University, a project to digitize, catalog, and publish the entire print run of the Theodore Roosevelt Association Journal to the online collection of the TR Center. Like Roosevelt, he is an avid birder himself. And without further ado, I would like to welcome Duane Jundt.
So greetings from flyover country. I'm from Iowa, so I know that has kind of a double meaning for this crowd. So greetings from flyover country. We're just starting to get some birds there. Just before I left, I saw my second yellow-rumped warbler. They're usually the first wood warbler that we get showing up. So we're getting into that season, where the season that my wife refers to herself as the warbler widow, because I'm constantly jumping up from the kitchen table, including during the middle of supper, to put my binoculars on a bird. What I'd like to talk about tonight is to talk about one of the many, many aspects of Theodore Roosevelt, and an aspect that isn't always as well known as some of the other ones. So we know Roosevelt as this incredibly diverse person who packed more into 60 years of life than really, it's almost sometimes incomprehensible. How did he do that? How was he a hunter, a rancher, a cowboy, a writer, a historian who was a president of the American Historical Association, an explorer? He was an assemblyman from New York City for the state legislature of New York. He was a rancher, owned ranches in Dakota. He was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He was the Police Commissioner of New York City. He was candidate for mayor of New York City. He was the colonel of the Rough Riders. He was governor of New York State. He was vice president, and he was president. And, oh, by the way, he just happens to be one of the most important people in the history of American birding. So that's how we want to look at him this evening. And I've identified what I call the great triumvirate of America's birds, or the three people who I think are most important in the history of American birding. And I'm sure a lot of you are aware of them. How can you not be if you're in the birding world? And the first person, of course, is John James Audubon. And Audubon, of course, is famous for his magisterial, The Birds of America. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with those oversized prints. In fact, most of them were, he painted those in life size. If you were to try to get a complete edition of The Birds of America today from Christie's or Sotheby's, it probably would set you back somewhere around $2 million to get a complete set of the Audubon prints. The important thing for us, as really for birders, for Audubon, is that because Audubon's work was so famous and became so well known, it really raised awareness about birds in the United States. And once you raise awareness, then people become concerned. So awareness leads to conservation. So Audubon, I think, is one of the most important people. The other important person or part of this triumvirate is Roger Tory Peterson. And Peterson, the really important thing about Peterson is this, and that is the Field Guide to Birds. So this is, I call this the little green book that changed American birding. So this came out in 1934, and this is really the first true pocket-sized bird guide. So you literally can fit this thing in your pocket. Before that, most ornithologies, or the way people would consult when they had to consult a book to look up a bird identification, they had to leave the field, right? So they'd see a bird, trying to remember, okay, it's got striped wings, it's got this kind of bill, it was doing this, and then you go home and you get out your massive ornithology. You can see one of these actually at Sagamore Hill in Oyster Bay. But Peterson changes that, having to do that when he comes out with his Field Guide to the Birds in 1934. So what this does is actually it really democratizes birding, because it makes it so much easier and so much more accessible. People can take this with them into the field, right? You can have this. And this came out even before a lot of people had binoculars, and binoculars, especially in TR's time, but even in Peterson's time, were not anything like the binoculars that we're used to today. So this book really helps revolutionize and democratizes and opens up birding to a lot of people. And then, of course, the last person there is Roosevelt. And now Roosevelt he could draw, but he wasn't a great artist like Audubon. He's not a birder or an artist on the level of Peterson. Why Roosevelt is in here is because of what Roosevelt does as president of the United States. And the power that he uses when he's president, that's what puts him in the rank of this. And then if I would expand this to a fourth person, the fourth person that we would include in this would be Rachel Carson, and for Silent Spring and the awareness that she brought to the DDT crisis. So the other thing that's important when we think about Roosevelt didn't just sort of come to birding. He didn't have this epiphany when he was president. He didn't take all of these conservation measures that we will talk about on behalf of birds in a vacuum. He didn't suddenly say, oh yeah, that sounds like a good thing to do. That will be important. Roosevelt was a lifelong birder. And in fact, Roosevelt, in his life and in his college career, Roosevelt was basically planning on becoming an ornithologist. And this is something that isn't widely known. We think of Roosevelt in all those other roles, right? Especially Colonel of the Rough Riders and a politician and president of the United States. Roosevelt, when he went to Harvard in the fall, I think in 1876, Roosevelt went to study science and biology and natural history. And Roosevelt was a birder from the time he was a small boy. He had his very own museum in his home called the Roosevelt Museum of Natural History. He shot and killed a lot of birds to study them. So I recently, this past summer, I like hunting antique stores for Roosevelt stuff. I found a bird guide, one of these ornithologies from 1889, and in the back of the bird guide, there was many, many pages, which you will not find in today's bird guide, about how to stuff and mount birds, because that's how people mostly studied birds, because you didn't have the binoculars and you didn't have the smartphone. So Roosevelt hunted and shot a lot of birds, and he studied them that way, and he mounted them. And a lot of Roosevelt's birds actually are still today at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. And I love this quote here. When I entered college, I was devoted to out-of-doors natural history, and my ambition was to be a scientific man of the Audubon or Wilson or Baird type. And so the interesting thing there, all three of those scientists that he's referring, he said, I aspire to be like one of these guys. They're all ornithologists. John James Audubon, Alexander Wilson, who was kind of Audubon's successor, and then Spencer Baird. So Roosevelt's basically saying, I sort of had planned on being an ornithologist. Roosevelt ended up not being an ornithologist for a number of reasons. One was that Harvard was not really interested in out of doors field history, natural outdoor field history. They were really concerned with laboratory work and microscope work. That did not appeal to Roosevelt. Roosevelt also fell in love with Alice Lee Hathaway, who was from Boston and was very much a Boston blue blood. And he was worried that he would not be able to keep her in her lifestyle that she had been grown accustomed to as a scientist. So he thought he'd better maybe find another route of work. And then the other thing that's really important is the gentleman in the picture there, Henry Davis Minot, or Hal Minot, who was Roosevelt's best friend at Harvard. And they were birding buddies. They were really close birding buddies. In fact, Roosevelt's first two publications, not only his first two birding publications, but his first two bird publications were bird lists that he compiled with Minot, both up in the Adirondacks and then out around Oyster Bay. And sometimes we call this a hinge point in history, when things can go one way or another. While Minot was at Harvard with TR, Minot had a nervous breakdown. And he ended up in what we would have called an asylum at the time. He ended up leaving Harvard. So the combination of his best friend and his best birding friend leaving Harvard, Harvard not really encouraging Roosevelt in field work, and then the emergence of the beautiful Alice Hathaway Lee, all of those sort of combined to conspire Roosevelt's career as an ornithologist. So I've entitled my program Birdwatcher in Chief, but Roosevelt, the primary way that Roosevelt interacted with birds, and maybe this is the way some of you do, is that he mostly interacted with birds through hearing. So if you look here, and that sound that Pat just played for you was of the bobolink, which is one of the birds that Roosevelt would have had out around his home at Sagamore Hill. I've just sort of compiled a list here. These are all words, I call it Roosevelt's birding thesaurus. These are all different ways that Roosevelt described different bird calls. So his primary way that he interacted with birds was through his hearing. Roosevelt did not get glasses. He needed glasses, but he didn't get glasses until he was the age of 13. So that may have contributed to that he developed hearing because his eyesight wasn't good. He couldn't see birds, so he probably was relying on his hearing. But I do think he had really well developed hearing too. And then Roosevelt's sight is going to deteriorate even further, which wasn't known at all at the time. So he had to wear glasses. His hearing was really good. And then while he was in the White House, when he was boxing with an Army officer, he got a detached retina and lost sight in one of his eyes completely while he was president. But the primary way that Roosevelt interacts with birds is through sound. And this is a slide. This is Roosevelt's home out on Long Island called Sagamore Hill. And I won't read all of this, but this is a passage that Roosevelt wrote, and he's describing the birds out at Sagamore Hill. And if you read through this passage, one thing you're going to find is there's not really much about birds. So we tend to look at birds as behavior. What's the bird doing? What's the bird look like? Color, markings, wing stripes, etc., and then sound. In this passage, the only way that Roosevelt describes the birds, it's all through sound. It's all through sound. That's the primary way that Roosevelt interacted with birds. So he says, I was sitting on my rocking chair. Roosevelt loved a rocking chair. He said, what good American doesn't love a rocking chair? The chiming of the wood thrushes, chanting their vespers, the warble of vireo. We heard the flight song of an ovenbird, an oriole sang. Catbirds sang, song sparrows. It's all about sound. That's the way that he primarily interacted with those birds. So one of the things that's also remarkable about Roosevelt was that he was a great writer, and he was a great nature writer. And he wrote, he had his time in Dakota from 1883 to 1887. He actually wrote 3 books about that. And in that, he spent a lot of time describing the landscape, describing the work of the cowboys, and also describing birds. And this passage, I think, this is one of my favorite Roosevelt passages. I think this may be one of the single best and most beautiful passages that Roosevelt ever wrote. And it's important because Roosevelt, because songs and noises were so important to him, he made a lot of associations with them. So Roosevelt would when he hears a certain bird and hears a certain song, it takes him back, it takes him to a point or a place in his life, and he makes that association. So what he's writing about here, he's writing about out at the Elkhorn Ranch in the Badlands. He's writing about being on the veranda of the Elkhorn Ranch, and this is what he's hearing, this is what he's seeing. It's just an incredibly moving passage. The other thing that's really important about this passage is that it's deeply, deeply autobiographical. So remember that when Roosevelt is out here in the Badlands, this is almost all of this is coming in the wake of that really tragic day that I'm sure some of you are aware of that story, the famous February 14th, 1884, where Roosevelt confronted on the same day in the same house on Valentine's Day the death of his mother and of his wife, who 2 days before had given birth to their first child, and which Roosevelt then proceeded for that day in his diary to put a huge X and say that the light has gone out of my life. And when Roosevelt would never speak and would never write about his first wife ever again. You can go through all of TR's over 150,000 letters and his 30 plus books and all of the articles and all of the things that he produced. And even in his autobiography, right, which is where you tell your story, there is not a single reference to his first wife. None. But there is here. There is here, because here he's telling us, right? He's telling us here, especially towards the end there. And I just think this passage is so beautiful. So he's describing his time in the Badlands again. He's on the veranda at the Elkhorn. And then he says, now and then the soft, melancholy cooing of the mourning dove, whose voice always seems far away and expresses more than any other sound in nature, the sadness of gentle, hopeless, never-ending grief. So he's talking about his grief, right? He's saying this bird, the mourning dove sound, that's the sound of gentle, hopeless, never-ending grief that I experienced. This is from 1883. Roosevelt writes another passage in another book, The Wilderness Hunter, in 1893, and describes the mourning dove, but there's nothing in it about gentle, hopeless, never-ending grief because he was been healed by that time. Been healed by that time. So I'm kind of anticipating a little bit, maybe one of your questions. TR's favorite bird, I think, I don't know, because he never explicitly said, but I think certainly one of the most important birds to Roosevelt was the meadowlark. So Roosevelt would have heard the eastern meadowlark out at Sagamore Hill, but the western meadowlark, the one that he would have heard and encountered out in the Badlands, is really, really important to him. Because again, it's a bird that has deep emotional resonance for him. It means something to him, just like it does to me. When I go home to North Dakota, when I go home to North Dakota and I hear a meadowlark, it tells me that I'm home, right? It tells me that I'm home. It's so sad. Meadowlarks are really in trouble. Meadowlark populations are just plummeting on the Great Plains and in the grasslands. They're not nearly as common as they used to be. But for Roosevelt, the meadowlark, and this passage again is just another beautiful example of how Roosevelt, of all his talents, was a great writer. And basically this passage, when he's talking about the meadowlark, it basically charts his emotional journey in the Badlands. So he says, and he's referring to the western meadowlark, its song has length, variety, power and rich melody, and there is in it sometimes a cadence of wild sadness, inexpressibly touching. For to me it comes forever laden with 100 memories in association, with the sight of dim hills reddening in the dawn, with the breath of cool morning winds blowing across lonely plains, with the scent of flowers on the sunlit prairie, with the motion of fiery horses, with all the strong thrill of eager and buoyant life. I mean, it's almost like you can see him galloping on Manitou across the prairie. It's picking up the pace. And he talks about in the beginning, inexpressibly wild sadness, and at the end, eager and buoyant life. So it's literally, when he's writing about the Song of the Meadowlark, he's tracing his emotional time there from grief and sadness to recovery and hope and optimism. It's just a wonderful example. And again, for Roosevelt, he hears the Meadowlark, his mind is going to go flashing back to Dakota. The other thing that's really important about Roosevelt and birds, we're going to talk about how Roosevelt, what he did on behalf of birds, but birds also, as I've tried to point out, were really important to him and they had an effect on him. This sometimes still is how we often see Roosevelt. There's the bully and also a bully, right? So when we sometimes think about, someone once referred to TR as a steam engine in trousers, or that TR defies all the laws of physics. He's pure act. I once saw someone actually at a conference one time actually said to me with a straight face, "Oh, I always thought Roosevelt was a homicidal maniac." Okay. And someone once called him, I read online, someone called him a macho Neanderthal. But Roosevelt had a very strong sentimental side. He had a very romantic streak. He loved poetry. He had to deal with depression a lot of his life coming off the events of 1884. So birds are really important because birds allow him to engage in that kind of more softer and gentler side of him. And and some of his biographers, Edmund Morris in particular, really feel like birds are really important for bringing out that side of him. And there actually is some evidence that birds really can have kind of that calming effect on people. I have here, I've been used this for a few years. There's actually a city in California that began a process of piping in bird songs into their downtown streets because they thought it would reduce crime. Because it would, hey, just chill out, man. Listen to the birds. It's okay, right? And then this is from another a study. It says, quote, psychologists are discovering that natural sounds, from the wind rustling the trees to the warble of songbirds, have benefits for humans and can lower stress, elevate mood, boost cognitive ability, and perhaps enhance healing. So Roosevelt was maybe onto something, and birds kind of played this role for him of calming him down and helping him. And that's why the songs are so important to him. So sometimes we still have this caricature. This is from a graphic novel series that came out in 2016 and 2017, where Roosevelt is just relentlessly, in kind of keeping, if you know anything about graphic novels, they can be pretty violent. Now I want to kind of switch gears a little bit and look at a couple, 3 or 4 episodes from Roosevelt's presidency that just kind of reveal some aspects about him and about his love for birds. And the first one of these, this is, of course, the famous picture. You see this. This is probably one of the most reproduced pictures of Roosevelt. This is Roosevelt with the great naturalist John Muir, the founder of the Sierra Club. This is them at Yosemite. When Roosevelt went with Muir in 1903, Roosevelt was what we call the Great Loop Tour, the Great Western Tour of 1903, 14,000 miles, 25 states, over 150 cities. He was gone from the White House for 2 months, all of April and May. He visited Muir, and he and Muir went into the Yosemite backcountry. This is where you get Roosevelt waking up one morning under 20 to 23 blankets covered in 4 to 5 inches of snow and saying, "This is the best day of my life." And this is, and Roosevelt is writing here about the bird songs, the thrushes in Yosemite, and talking about comparing Yosemite to a cathedral and how beautiful it was. One of the things that Roosevelt didn't like about this trip was Muir, because Muir realized, hey, I have a great opportunity here. I want to advocate for the protection of the sequoias. I want to advocate for the further protection and the expansion of Yosemite National Park. I've got the President of the United States to myself. I'm going to jaw his ear off. Roosevelt did not like this because Muir was talking so much that Roosevelt couldn't listen to the birds. And Muir wasn't particularly interested in birds, which Roosevelt almost found to be almost a moral flaw in him. In fact, when Muir would die in December of 1914, Roosevelt was asked to write, kind of a little encomium, a little tribute to him, and he called it John Muir, an appreciation. And even in his appreciation for Muir, TR couldn't help but point out that Muir didn't really like birds, and he couldn't quite understand why that was. So. This is a nice example. This is from the following year. This is from 1904. Roosevelt wrote a lot of these, what he called picture letters. So this is a letter, again, on White House stationery. He's writing this to his youngest son, Quentin, who he often referred to as Quenty-Quee. Quentin is the son that would be killed in World War I as an aviator, shot down in combat in World War I in 1918. And Roosevelt, again, this is Roosevelt, this president of the United States. He's writing a note on White House stationery, and he's telling Quentin about the birds that are out in the White House lawn. And he says, the little birds in the nest and the vines on the garden fence are nearly grown up. The mother still feeds them. You can see the mother bird with a worm in her beak and the little birds with their beaks wide open, exclamation point. So he has this enthusiasm for birds. So I love this because this is sort of a tangible piece of evidence or a way, remember, the British, that supports the assertion made by the British ambassador to the United States, who also happened to be the best man at TR's second wedding, Cecil Spring Rice, who said, you must remember that the president is about 6. See? He has this boyish enthusiasm, and it comes through here with this writing this picture letter to his son. This is another great example. This is one of my favorite little anecdotes about Roosevelt and birds. This is from 1905. So we've done 1903, 1904, now 1905. This is when Roosevelt went out in 1905. He went on a bear hunting trip out to Colorado. And when he was on his way back from that trip, he stopped in Denver. And Roosevelt, this is from what Roosevelt wrote about, that he wrote. He wrote a story about this, and it was later compiled into a book, Outdoor Pastimes of an American Hunter. It's called A Colorado Bear Hunt. And one of the interesting things, even in his hunting stories, where Roosevelt, you'd think his primary preoccupation would be with telling about the hunting down and shooting of the bear, like the great hunter he was. But even there, Roosevelt just couldn't, get away from the fact that he wanted to talk about birds. And one of the things that he talked about was when he was in Denver and at the hotel that he was staying at in Denver, that he was so happy that they had house finches there. And so he made that a part of his article. He says, the cities of the southwestern states are to be congratulated on having this spirited, attractive little songster as a familiar dweller around their houses and in their gardens. So Roosevelt is in Denver, and he's congratulating Denver, what? Not for their great street system, not for their new opera house, not for their enlightened tax policy. No, because they have house finches. Right. And one of the main reasons that Roosevelt was really interested in this was because he was happy that they had house finches and they didn't have house sparrows. And Roosevelt did not like house sparrows. And we will come back to that. And this is what Roosevelt wrote in the same article about house sparrows. He says, the latter are all too plentiful in Denver, as in every other city, and as always are noisy, quarrelsome, in short, thoroughly unattractive and disreputable. The house finch, on the contrary, is attractive in looks, in song, and in ways. It was delightful to hear the male singing, often on the wing. So again, Roosevelt, just that enthusiasm that he has for birds, that he even, he's in a major American city in the West, Denver, and he's got to point out that they have house finches. And the other thing that I like about this, if you can see that picture, that's Roosevelt before the age of electrical amplification, standing on a chair to talk and to hear his voice. And I just think I admire him that so much because that's incredibly brave. How many politicians would be willing today to get up on a chair? And you can imagine, we know Roosevelt, this and that, and the body language and how he did not topple off the chair is beyond me, but bully for him. And I love, this is also from Roosevelt's time. This is the document here dates from 1908, but I love this quote from Edmund Morris. Edmund Morris, if you're not aware, Edmund Morris wrote the great 3-volume biography of Theodore Roosevelt, and especially well known for the first volume, The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt. But he has this great quote: White House groundsmen, unaware that he was a published ornithologist, were puzzled by his habit of standing under trees motionless for long periods of time. So, right, we can all relate to that as birders, right? So we know what that means. It's wonderful. It's one of the great things about TR. As birders, we can relate to these things, but just that, you must have wondered what is he doing, right? What is he doing? And again, here in 1908, just as he was about to leave the presidency, Roosevelt was asked to make a bird list, right? So another way that we as birders can relate to TR made a bird list. And then, but one of the things I love about this, so as a historian, this is when I really geek out as a historian at looking at a document, because I look at this document in two ways. I look at it as a birder and to say, okay, here's his list. He said he was asked to make a list of all the birds that he had encountered at the White House. So he did that, made a list like we do. But then the other thing that's wonderful about Roosevelt, and again, it just shows an aspect of his personality. He couldn't just list all the birds, right? He had to put in commentary, right? He had to give his opinion. So he says there where it says sparrowhawk, which we would think of as being a Cooper's hawk. He said, a pair spent the last 2 winters in and around the White House grounds, feeding on the sparrows, largely, thank heaven, on the English sparrows. So again, his old nemesis. He's glad that the Cooper's hawks are feeding on the sparrows, mostly the house sparrows, right? So he just had to get that in. So it's just another wonderful little example that reveals a side of his real enthusiasm for birding. And then the other thing that I wanted to point out here, these illustrations that I've used here, these are actually scans that I did of these little cards. And I don't know if any of you that are birders are familiar with these, but these are little cards that used to be placed in boxes of Arm & Hammer baking soda. So you would, when you bought a box of Arm & Hammer baking soda, you would get one of these little bird conservation cards. And these came out first in 1908. 1908, when someone we know was president. They were in boxes of baking soda from 1908 to 1938. And the artist there is Louis Agassiz Fuertes, who was probably the best American bird illustrator between Audubon and Peterson. Louis Agassiz Fuertes, he did a number of these cards. And then it's important too to remember that Roosevelt had allies. I call allies in the arena. He had people who helped him understand the issues with birds, helped guide him in the things that he will do as president in behalf of birds. And I've just identified 3 of them here. The first one is John F. Lacey, who is a congressman from Iowa. So we're very happy and proud to have John Lacey. John Lacey is responsible for 3 really important acts of legislation that will really benefit conservation in the United States. He's not nearly as well known as he should be. He's not even as well known in Iowa as he should be. John F. Lacey, Republican congressman from Oskaloosa, Iowa. He's responsible for the Yellowstone Park Protection Act of 1894, which basically finally instituted some real laws and put some teeth into. Yellowstone had been a park since 1872, but the enforcement wasn't there. This act put the enforcement in it. And he's also known for the Lacey Act of 1900, which prohibited the selling across state lines of animals and birds and animals that had been killed illegally. And then most important for Roosevelt, it's Lacey who will get across the Antiquities Act. And the Antiquity Act is what gives the president the right and the privilege to declare national monuments. And he'll get that to Roosevelt in 1906. And boy, will Roosevelt use that, and will declare 18 national monuments. along with the 5 national parks and the 4 game reserves and the 150 national parks and 150 national forests and the almost 230 million acres of land that Roosevelt set aside. And why that's important for us is because that's a lot of bird habitat. That's a lot of bird habitat. You're not just protecting the Grand Canyon because it's a nice ditch, or Mesa Verde because of the cliff dwellings, or Jewel Cave because of the cavern. All those places have a ton of bird habitat as well. So Lacey's really important. Frank Chapman, the chap, RR in the middle there, he was the chief ornithologist at the American Museum of Natural History. He was also the editor for many, many years, decades, of the Audubon Society magazine, and he will be very important to Roosevelt. I'll come back to him in just a little bit. So he became friends with Roosevelt when Roosevelt was governor of New York State, and they remained friends for the last 20 years of Roosevelt's life. And then the man on the end there is John Burroughs, who was probably the most famous naturalist and natural history writer, maybe after Muir. They probably were competing for the top spot, Muir and Burroughs. Burroughs was a great birder. He spent a lot of time birding with Roosevelt. On that 1903 trip that I mentioned earlier, remember Roosevelt spent 3-4 days with Muir in Yosemite. He spent 2 weeks with Burroughs in Yellowstone. President of the United States went into the backcountry of Yellowstone for 2 weeks and birded with John Burroughs. And John Burroughs would come to Pine Knot, Roosevelt's presidential retreat, and bird with him there. And Roosevelt often would actually defer to Burroughs on bird identifications. He would say, John. He would call him John. That was an affectionate Dutch term, Uncle John. He would always defer to him on bird IDs. So the Roosevelt, I call this the Roosevelt philosophy. So what you're seeing here is actually the backside of these bird cards that I had referenced earlier. And you see there, right on the bottom, it says, for the good of all, do not destroy the birds. And I think that's just a wonderful way to encapsulate Roosevelt's thinking. And it's also important because remember, at this time, when these cards first came out, there wasn't really any pesticides. Right? So now today, unfortunately, we rely on herbicides and pesticides. There weren't that many chemical pesticides at all. So people sort of came to an understanding of, hey, the more birds we have, the more insects they're going to eat. So we need those in our orchards. We need those around our farms. So this is really, really important for Roosevelt. Do not destroy the birds. Bird conservation. And then the other part that's really important here is that illustration of the woman there with her hat. So one of the primary threats to birds in the United States at the turn of the 20th century was a fashion craze. It was a fashion craze for these elaborate, over-the-top women's hats that were decorated with bird plumes, and actually were decorated, and the most desirable ones were these large white ones that would come from herons and egrets and pelicans, but especially herons and egrets. And this was causing a huge burden on that population. So this was one of the, there were other concerns with birds as well, but this was one of the major ones that was faced. And then our friend back here, Frank Chapman took two walks in Manhattan, and just walking the streets of Manhattan, he identified 40 different birds on women's hats. And that was really sort of, kind of smacks you in the face. And he relayed that to Roosevelt, that information, that this is how birds were being used. And one of the reasons that when this issue came up, one of the reasons that this resonated with Roosevelt, because Roosevelt, again, one of the things, he had been two things, remember, or one of the two many things. One was a historian. So Roosevelt realized what had almost happened to the beaver. The beaver had almost been exterminated in the United States because of a fashion craze in Europe for beaver felt hats. That phase, the only reason the beaver got saved in this country was because that fad ended. And then Roosevelt also, the bison, as we know, also, or the buffalo, almost became extinct in this country because they were being slaughtered mostly for their hides to be used as industrial belts. And Roosevelt, even to a certain degree, because he killed 2 buffalo, because he had to have a buffalo mount for his home. He had participated in that. So he was aware of what could happen to a species. And Roosevelt had also seen what had happened to the Carolina parakeet that had gone extinct. And Roosevelt actually will be one of the last people to have a verifiable sighting of the passenger pigeon, which ultimately would go extinct, even though Alexander Wilson, one time in Kentucky, watched a flock go over him over the course of 2 days that numbered, by his estimation, 2 billion birds. And it went extinct. So, and Roosevelt's a historian. He has an understanding of if we don't act, something really bad is going to happen here. So we have then, this becomes then what I call, in some ways, a perfect storm of events, or a perfect storm from birds, because now you have Theodore Roosevelt, who's president of the United States, who just happens to know an awful lot about birds, who loves birds, and there's a crisis facing birds. This is a wonderful confluence of events in some ways. And it's important to remember too, and we have these discussions a lot now these days, Roosevelt believed in a very vigorous executive. So a lot of the presidents that preceded him, McKinley, Hayes, Garfield, Arthur, so forth, did not use a lot of presidential power. They deferred to Congress. Congress reigned supreme during that era between the end of the Civil War and the beginning of the 20th century. Roosevelt's political hero was Abraham Lincoln, who met a crisis with vigorous executive power. And Roosevelt wanted to do the same thing. So Roosevelt learned about what was happening to the birds. In particular, he heard about what was happening down in Pelican Island in Florida. He heard about that actually from Frank Chapman, who we talked a little bit about. And Pelican Island was owned by the federal government. It was federal government property, but the birds there were being slaughtered. So Roosevelt went to his Attorney General, Philander C. Knox, and said, is there any law, is there anything in the Constitution that would prohibit me from taking this land and making it a federal preserve and setting it aside to protect these bird populations? And Knox came back to him and said, no, there's not. And this is when you get the very famous, well, then I so declared. And then he went on to do that, not once, not twice, not 10, not 20, not 30, not 40, but 50 more times. Roosevelt will establish 51 federal bird reservations. And those federal bird reservations are going to be what today we would think of as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife National Wildlife Refuge System. That has its beginnings in Roosevelt's presidency. And then this is just another, this is just a nice example of Roosevelt and Roosevelt's thinking. You remember too that Roosevelt was vice president candidate in 1900, ran for the presidency on his own in 1904, and then left the presidency, much to his regret, in 1908, and then decided to run again in 1912. This is a great little quote, again, for a historian. These are these little gems that are oftentimes quite revealing to us. This is during the 1912 campaign when Roosevelt was running as the third party candidate on the Bull Moose Party. And this was during when they were talking about what the party platform should be. And Roosevelt leaned over next to someone close to him and said, you know, I'd much rather discuss ornithology than politics. So you want to know why Roosevelt lost in 1912? Birds. There you go. And then this is another picture of Sagamore Hill. We looked at one earlier with a bird quote. This is another, I think, beautiful quote from this is from Roosevelt's autobiography. He says, at Sagamore Hill, we love a great many things: birds and trees and books and all things beautiful, and horses and rifles and children and hard work and the joy of life. It's a beautiful passage. But for us, what's the first thing on that list? Birds. Birds. Birds are the first thing on that list. And in that autobiography, right, remember we talked about at the very beginning, all those things that Roosevelt did in his life: Rough Rider, vice president, president, police commissioner of New York City, assistant secretary of the Navy, New York City assemblyman, hunter, rancher, cowboy, on and on and on. That's a lot to fill any autobiography, right? And one of TR's favorite subjects was himself. So you would think in an autobiography, there's a lot to write about. And what does Roosevelt do in his autobiography? He leaves room for not one, not two, not three, not four, not five, not six, not seven, not eight, not nine, 10 consecutive pages about birds. Because he can't help himself, right? If birds come into his head, he's going to look at them, he's going to listen to them. When he's younger, he's going to shoot them, he's going to study them, he's going to mount them, he's going to write about them. And he's in his autobiography, again, think of all that he could have talked about, but he spent 10 pages devoted that to the study of birds. And then the other thing that I think is really important here is that, and all things beautiful, all things beautiful. Last fall, I was at the annual Theodore Roosevelt Center Symposium out at Dickinson State in Western North Dakota. The topic last year was conservation. And we were asking ourselves at one point, sort of, why did Roosevelt care so much about conservation? Where did that come from? Why did he feel so passionate about that? And it sort of struck me later on. Sometimes you get these epiphanies when you've been studying something for so long. I think one of the real reasons is that Roosevelt just loved beautiful things. He loved beautiful things, and he loved, we know now, beautiful bird music. He loved beautiful birds. He loved the Grand Canyon. He thought, right, the most famous words in the history of the American conservation movement, leave it as it is. Man can only mar it. The ages have been at work on it, and man can do nothing good to it. So he loved beautiful things. And I think everybody, if you ask any historians, when did the United States have its most beautiful coinage? Most beautiful currency? Under Roosevelt. You go to Roosevelt's home, it's just filled with beautiful objects. So I think an appreciation for beauty is also important for Roosevelt. And then lastly, this is yet another quote from Edmund Morris. Roosevelt's grave awaited him at the top of a steep knoll. He had always enjoyed the bird song in that fir forested corner, and long ago decided that he wanted to be buried there. I mean, think about, again, all those roles that Roosevelt had. Roosevelt could have obviously, because he was a decorated veteran, he obviously could have been laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery. He was entitled to that. No one would have blamed him for being put to rest somewhere prominent in New York City. You couldn't blame him at all if he wanted to be buried in his beloved Badlands, but he chose this spot not far from his home, again, because Morris says, because he always enjoyed the bird song there. And what's right up against that cemetery today, Young Cemetery, what's right next to Young Cemetery? The Theodore Roosevelt Audubon Bird Sanctuary, the first Audubon bird sanctuary in the country is there. Okay? And so Roosevelt, I think the thing I want to leave you with is that, again, Roosevelt, by the end of his life, Roosevelt was not really that much involved in politics. He obviously was no longer a soldier. He was no longer a hunter. He was no longer an explorer. But in the beginning, in the middle, and in the end, because even at the end, when his body is racked with rheumatism, he's still sitting on one of his beloved rocking chairs on the piazza at Sagamore Hill, listening to birds. And thank you for listening.
Thank you, Duane. We're going to go ahead and have some question and answer now. If you can stay right where you are, because we've got the camera right on you.
Great.
We have questions in the audience here in person.
When Roosevelt went to Brazil, did he do any writing about the birds that were down there?
Yeah, he did. And actually, it's kind of interesting. He did write. If you go to that book, and I'm sorry that the title of it escapes me right now, but he did write a book about exploring the River of Doubt and about going down there and seeing the birds. But literally in that book, the single largest passage when he gets to writing about birds, he actually, I call it patriotic ornithology, because he ends up actually just writing about birds at Sagamore Hill. Seriously, because he's saying to himself, I can't remember the passage entirely, but I've written about this. he literally, when he started hearing the birds in Brazil, he said, oh, because he was there, he said, oh, now back home, if I was back home at Sagamore now, we'd be hearing this, and I'd be seeing this, and we'd be hearing some of this. And this bird is really great. And it was just literally like his nationalism came out in his birding. And in fact, he does the same thing in African game trails, because he went on that long safari in 1909 and 1910. And if you look in African game trails, he does the same thing. He goes off on this riff about the superiority of American birds. Yeah, that's just why he's just so fun. So.
Any other questions? Pat, are there any online?
No, there weren't at the time, but I'll double check again.
Well, Pat's double checking, just some shameless plugs for some upcoming events. I have a free cookie for anyone who can tell me what Friday is. Anybody? Any guesses? Well, the last Friday of April is National Historic Marker Day, and we will be celebrating here at the TR site when we will be unveiling our new National Landmark Historic Marker at 2 p.m. with a media event. We'll be joined by our county executive and our mayor and our Congressman Kennedy as well, who will be unveiling our new marker. And that is the start to a whole month of preservation themed events. May is National Preservation Month. We are celebrating with half-price admission for all Erie County residents through the month of May. We will also have a traveling exhibit from Western New York Library Resource Council and our adjoining traveling exhibit space on Louise Bethune, Buffalo, and America's first woman professional architect. And again, on May 27th, for our next speakers night, we will have Bernice Radel, Executive Director from Preservation Buffalo Niagara, speaking on Buffalo's unique architecture and historic legacy right here at Buffalo and Erie County's first national landmark. And with that, thank you, Duane, for a wonderful presentation.